Good morning, everyone. My name is Rosemary Rung. I'm chairing the HB737 Commission on PFAS health and environmental effects from the St. Gobain operations in Merrimack. This is our monthly meeting, and we're very fortunate to have guests today, which I'll introduce in a minute. But first off, I believe we have a quorum. I think everyone's gotten the minutes from our September meeting. I sent those out earlier in the week. I'll entertain a motion to accept those minutes. Moved by Mr. Dunn, seconded by Mr. Bandazian. Are there any corrections or edits to those minutes? Seeing none, I'll take all those in favor of accepting the minutes as submitted, please raise your hand. Great, thank you. Motion passes. Because of time constraints, I'm going to turn the floor over to Mr. Wimsatt. He has to leave for another meeting, so he's going to present the DES report. Mr. Wimsatt, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and again, thank you for accommodating my scheduling problem this morning. So the update for this month, we'll start as I often do with the Air Division's update. Stack testing took place on August 24th and 25th. And DES had two experienced staff members present to observe the method samples were collected in the operation of the towers at the during the stack test. The regenerative thermal oxidizer, or RTO, did not encounter any issues, and the stack test was completed as designed. DES expects the stack test report to be submitted within 60 days after the completion of testing, which is required by the air permit and the rules. Relative to bypass operations, since the last update to the Commission in September, St. Gobain has had 4 minutes of bypass during a power interruption due to a circuit break at the Reeds Ferry substation, and 1 hour when the RTO was in operation, but the hourly average temperature was 1830.9 degrees Fahrenheit. Of course, the permitted minimum hourly average temperature is 1832, so it was a little bit more than a degree below that. St. Gobain reported that the first event resulted in, and forgive my use of scientific notation here, but it's the easiest way to describe these numbers, 5.19 times 10 to the minus 7th pounds of PFOA. So that's another way of saying a very small mass of PFOA, and 6.95 times 10 to the minus 9th pounds of PFOS. And in my written report, I put those out in decimals, but I won't read all the zeros for you so that you can understand what that represents. The amount of those materials emitted from the facility and the second event did not result in any emissions released from the bypass stack. St. Gobain took corrective action for the low temperature issue by adjusting the tuning parameters of the control equipment. And with regard to general reporting and the provisions of the former consent decree, St. Gobain has completed the rainwater study that was required in the consent decree that it entered into with the Air Division some time ago. And the data for that is available, and can certainly provide a copy of that. What I might do, there's a slide that Kathy Bean provided in a recent presentation regarding rainwater and putting it in the context of other states who have done rainwater. And what I'll do is I'll include that slide when I provide a copy of my talking points to the secretary or to the clerk. I will include a copy of that slide for reference purposes so people can see that. And then on to the Waste Management Division's update. On June 29th, DES received a work plan for the installation of point of entry treatment, or POET systems, at the properties identified in the June 23rd agreement. DES reviewed and approved the work plan with stipulations in a letter dated August 22nd. And as always, there'll be links to these various documents in the notes that I provide to the clerk, so you'll be able to click on those and see those documents when you look at the minutes. DES met with St. Gobain on September 13th to discuss its comments and received a revised work plan on September 26th. DES received and approved the work plan with stipulations in a letter dated October 5th. St. Gobain is nearing a point of finalizing contracts with its contractors for POET installation. It's expected that property owners who are to receive POET systems will start being notified by the contractors in November, with installation starting shortly after that. St. Gobain's contractors have indicated that they believe all the poets can be installed in less than 1 year, so by the fall of 2023. On July 12th, DES received a remedial action implementation report that documented the provision of alternate water for each property described in the original 2018 consent decree. And DES is in the process of reviewing that report and will provide comment as needed. St. Gobain's proceeding with design work for water line installations in the towns of Litchfield, Bedford, and Merrimack. With the exception of the Wildcat Falls and Brenda Lane area in Merrimack, these are areas with existing water lines where homes simply require connections to the water mains at the street. For the MVD water main extension projects that are associated with Wildcat Falls and Brenda Lane, which are going to require a water line extension as well as the connections to the street, WSP Gold, or St. Gobain's consultant, is on track to provide a 60% design documents to MVD for review in December, with the idea of finalizing the design based on any MVD feedback during Q1 of 2023, and then bid the project for a spring 2023 start. St. Gobain is also working with a water provider and currently evaluating the feasibility of the water line extensions within the town of Londonderry. St. Gobain will continue to work on this evaluation over the fall and winter. On August 17th, DES met with St. Gobain to discuss the requested application for a groundwater management permit and groundwater management zone. It was determined that St. Gobain would not be able to submit the application by the due date of August 26th. So DES met with them, with DOJ and their attorney and St. Gobain's attorneys on October 4th to discuss further sampling and the application for the permit. So those discussions are ongoing, and I'll keep the commission apprised as that progresses. We've met generally bi-weekly with St. Gobain and discussed measures to address ongoing issues pertaining to delays in bottled water deliveries to residents. St. Gobain finalized a contract with an additional bottled water vendor during the week of August 22nd, and the letters were the week of September 6th, notifying 231 property owners of the change in bottled water provider. Based on recent conversations with St. Gobain, approximately half of those 231 homes have set up and transitioned to the new provider. The number of water calls that we're receiving has been greatly reduced and actually nearly eliminated in recent weeks. St. Gobain is prepared to transfer more homes over to the new contractor based on geographic location, and will continue to monitor the situation. Moving on to water supply sampling. St. Gobain presented a work plan, as you all know, for residential well sampling, and we're now at a point where we've received 15 addenda. That's the same in the previous meeting. We don't have a new addendum since then. So we've expressed a need for an additional sampling addendum to complete sampling of additional wells within the consent decree area, and we're hoping to receive that in the coming. As of September 28th, and again, this has been reflected to update these numbers to reflect the addendum 15. It's got some new numbers, but the number of homes offered sampling hasn't changed because, again, we don't have a new addendum. So we're at 3,801 properties that have been identified for sampling. 3,790 access agreements were sent, and that's 100 more than the June report. That represents coming on about 69, almost 70% return rate for those access agreements. 2,365 samples have been collected from water supply wells, and that's 24 more than the September report. And then 1,012 properties have been offered bottled water as a result of exceedances of the standard in sampling, and that's 5 more than the September report. So moving to site investigation, St. Gobain's consultant will be conducting post-RTO stormwater sampling with a timing dependent on weather conditions. Recent storms over the summer didn't provide good opportunities for that because of concerns about safety and lightning. I don't know, honestly, whether this storm that we're experiencing right now has provided an opportunity for that or not. It's not always helpful when it occurs beginning overnight, but we'll see. I don't have information on that yet, but certainly with the pattern we're in right now, we would expect that sampling would occur sometime this fall. A remedial action plan is due to DES 120 days after the company receives analytical results from the stormwater sampling. So that the date of that stormwater sampling becomes important for when we're going to receive that remedial action plan. And then, as I noted earlier, we are still waiting for a groundwater permit application, and we're working with them and their attorneys to try to resolve concerns about that. So with that, that concludes my update, and I'll be happy to field any questions.
Are there any questions for Mr. Wimsatt? Yes, Dr. Woods.
Just an offhand question. I couldn't but notice your clock in the background. It seems like it's got a problem.
Well, I will confess that the reason that I'm stressed for time this morning is that I have to appear before the fiscal committee, and so I'm squatting in the transportation committee's room. So apparently, time is not a concern for them.
Sorry, I just observing.
Okay. Yes, Mr. Preventure.
Yes, hi, Mr. Wimsatt. I was wondering if the numbers that you reported on the pounds of PFAS that were bypassed, could you report those, convert those into nanograms? Is it the pounds, the same units as the permit? Is that why they're being reported in pounds?
It is in pounds. And actually, I'm glad you asked that question, because I kind of, yesterday when I saw these numbers, I kind of asked myself the same question. And I did do a conversion.
Oh, good.
So, and my notes are a little cryptic here, but I think that if you do it in nanograms, it comes out to 227,000 nanograms, that PFOA number. I didn't do it for the PFOS, but the PFOA number.
Wow, okay. It's I think people are more used to hearing PFAS presented in nanograms, so it kind of gives a better context to everything.
Right. And understand though that we usually, when we talk about nanograms, it's in a water concentration, yeah. Right? So that's not what this is. It's just a mass of the contaminant that they would estimate have been, and this is based on the stack testing they did before and the performance based, figuring out not stack testing for the RTO, but previous stack testing, and right. Basically just making assumptions. So it's not a measured value. It's making assumptions about how they know, you know, how emissions occur when they're not controlled by an RTO.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure.
Any other questions for Mr. Wimsatt? Yes, Mr. Bendazian.
Mike, do you have any estimate of how long it will take for the groundwater management permit to be arrived at? And if for strategic reasons you can't say, I understand that.
Yeah, I wish I knew. We've still got some issues to work out, so I don't know the answer to that.
Representative Bohm, Representative LaSalle, do you have any questions?
No, I don't. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I have a few things, Mr. Wimsatt. One is just for your information, and also Ms. Rogers, who's here representing DHHS. Ms. Murphy is taking the notes today, so please copy her on any of your reports.
I'll be sure to do that.
Okay, thank you. And also regarding the stormwater testing, who makes the call whether a storm is appropriate to have testing conducted?
So that's the consultant for Saint-Gobain, and most of their calls are based on safety issues, and it's not uncommon for it to be difficult between the drought and then when we did have rain events this summer. They tended to be associated with electrical storms. It's very common for standard procedures for consulting firms. They don't want their staff out in an electrical storm trying to do sampling for safety reasons. And then the other issue that comes up is the storm has to be of a certain magnitude to give you basically valid data on stormwater runoff, and it needs to follow previous rain events by at least 72 hours. And then if it happens sort of largely overnight, there are issues of lighting and again, safety, because not all the stormwater sampling, you know, some of the stormwater sampling is done in difficult to access locations. So it ends up being really the call of the consulting firm, whether or not they go out and do the sampling.
Okay, thank you. And then one other comment I have, it's actually a request I'm hoping maybe you can follow up on, is it would be helpful to me, and I think to all of our constituents, to have like a bar graph of all of the residents that need remediation. And let's say if we even start with all of those on bottled water and show a bar graph with how many of those are have been deemed to have POET systems, or they're going to be hooked up, and maybe have that bar graph on a time scale. I'd like to just get an idea of how we're moving people from bottled water to a remediation source. And are people on POET systems, are they all going to be addressed before we get to the water hookups, or just something? I think a graphical representation, it's going to help me get a better grip on us moving forward, but it's something that we can give out to our communities, because I am getting an uptick on questions about when all of this is going to happen. It's usually actually from Bedford residents in the Stebbins Pond area. So I think something, if we can take your data and put it in a graphical form, that will be more effective in informing our residents, would be helpful.
Sure,
So
we can.
With, I'm sure you do at DES. Maybe you
We can work on something like that. Absolutely. Yeah, and in the past, the information people have asked for, there's so many different iterations of information, inside, outside the consent decree, what's been done already, what's not, what's still pending. So it becomes a little complicated to sort out all the numbers sometimes. But actually, I think that'd be really helpful, and we can work on something like that, and maybe come to the next meeting with a kind of a mock-up of, or a proposal for how we'd like to present it, and then you can comment on that, and then we can all decide what is the most helpful.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it, because we have been going from this real macro problem issue down to more specific actions, and I think we're at a point where that might trigger some more community communication. All right, thank you very much.
Yep, we'd be happy to do that.
Okay. And then before we move on to our next guest, oh yes, Mr. Ayotte.
Thank you, Chairman Rung. I just had a couple of quick questions in it. They may be uninformed, so I apologize to Mike up front, but I wonder, I don't know who the consultant is for the stormwater, but I just wondered if they'd considered or have the capacity to employ auto samplers for stormwater sampling, which might alleviate some of the problems of getting out safely and at odd times and so on. Those can be programmed, as you know, and can collect at certain specified flow rates after certain times and so on. Just a thought, just wanted to share that. And then on the POETs, I'm sure it exists, and maybe you could point me to it. Is there a place I could just go to look at the plan for monitoring and sampling after installation and things like that? I know I should probably know that.
There is, and actually, in the minutes that will be published as a result of this, the talking points that I provide to Representative Murphy will include hot links to some of the documents, and that work plan is referenced in there, so you'll be able to link right to it when you see the minutes.
Perfect, thank you.
Okay, any other questions for Mr. Wimsatt? Mr. Wimsatt, you are excused. Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Prevention, not yet.
I'll make it real quick. I think you had reported that the 225,000 nanograms is PFOA. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm. That's correct, I believe so. Yeah.
So is that PFOA being used as a raw product, or is that being sort of created in the reformulation process or something? I thought they were not using PFOA any further.
I don't believe it's a raw product per se. I think it is, but I believe it is present in small concentrations in some of the towers that we're operating. And that's why they calculated that amount. It's not a primary constituent, as I understand it, of their formulations that they're using right now, but it is not completely absent either.
So is that like a residual that's in the tower coating or something? Or I'm just trying
I
to
don't
figure
believe so. I believe it is still present in the, the folks from our air division would know that answer better. So I can touch base with Kathy about that.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Just trying to reconcile with all the previous statements about we haven't used PFOA for 10 years or something now. So that doesn't kind of trying to reconcile that, but appreciate it. Thanks a lot.
Okay.
Yeah, I agree with Mr. Preventure. I think that would be very helpful to know if they're still using that as a process input. Thank you. Okay, seeing no other questions, thank you very much, Mr. Wimsatt. I appreciate you, your report.
You're welcome.
I'm very happy to have a special presentation today by Dr. Jonathan Patali, who's the toxicologist for DES, and also Mr. Anthony Druin, who is the director of DES's biosolids program. They have we're going to report a new study to them, and I think it's very timely, as biosolids has been a hot issue as far as PFAS contamination goes, particularly in Maine, our neighbors of Maine, but I think we can really benefit from learning more about it. So I'm going to hand over the floor to Dr. Patali, and thank you very much
Sure.
for agreeing to present with us and actually offering to. I appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem. So hi, everyone. I know I've come and done the Dog and Pony Show a couple of times for you before. I was just wanting to reach out about this because we had seen a sort of draft of that internal report that you're working on, the interim report, I should say. And so there was some confusion around some terminology related to food and biosolids. So Anthony and I thought we'd come and give a presentation just to let you know what's sort of being done and just some helpful other considerations if you're looking at this sort of exposure pathway, concerns related to biosolids and food processing. So I'll cover a few short slides beforehand, and then Anthony has a slightly longer presentation to go over where he will focus on biosolids, and then we'll answer questions at the end. Nancy, I know you're taking notes. I will send a PDF copy of this, so don't worry about writing everything down. And if there's anything that you miss, feel free to shoot me an email and I can help you with the notes.
Thanks, John.
No problem. So again, I'm a toxicologist. The way that I focus on this is how are people exposed to chemicals, not just PFAS, a lot of other chemicals, but I thought it'd be helpful to sort of start here. That way we understand what's the risk we're trying to mitigate. So with PFAS, the main source of exposure that currently in the scientific literature we're the most concerned with is ingestion, and that's where we're going to talk about sort of biota and food. Dermal skin contact is considered a less important source of exposure at this time at most environmental concentrations we see, and inhalation is sort of this gray box area where we're still trying to figure out which PFAS are actually volatile, which ones present a unique risk for inhalation. So that's something that we're still looking into. And actually, we're due to give a report, I believe, at the beginning of January relative to what DES is looking at relative to this. So I'm going to focus on this ingestion pathway, right? So how do we go from food products to people being exposed? And I thought it'd be helpful to sort of break this down into 3 categories. So that first one is the environmental contribution. So water, soil, sediment that organisms or plants are grown in, their food web, and how environmental releases tie back to that. But that's not the only way that our dietary pathway for PFAS can be impacted. There's things like food processing and packaging. So this could happen at local level, state level, nationally, internationally, where depending on the process or packaging that's used for certain food items, we can introduce PFAS that way. So regardless of where the food is grown, you could still have introduction of PFAS. And then finally, there's this sort of in-home, where maybe cookware, PFAS in water that you're cooking with, or some other unique sources might contribute to someone's dietary exposure. And the reason I sort of categorize these in 3 ways is sort of understanding where do either different state agencies or federal agencies come into play. So when you're thinking of past legislation or future legislation, understanding who are the ones that might be passing those regulations, or where is it that you might be able to look at if you're thinking about actions to take. So I'm going to start backwards from that with in-home. I'm not going to read all this off. It's not slideshow karaoke, but I just thought having the information here would be good to reference back. So in general, within home, we worry about things like Teflon coating or nonstick cookware that may have PFAS or PFAS reused in the process of applying nonstick surfaces. I know if you go out to like Hannaford's right now or some of the other grocery stores, you can buy nonstick pans that say they're PFOA free. That doesn't mean they're PFAS free. EPA did try to phase out PFOA and PFOS, so there is a link there to their program, but it doesn't really mean that that's phased out for international products. So that's still an issue where people might be buying consumer goods, bringing those into their household or certain cookware items that could be introducing PFAS that way. In New Hampshire, we do have our MCLs that restrict PFAS levels in drinking water, but that would also be the same water most people would be cooking with. As we look forward to what EPA may be doing, they have their interim advisories and are expected at the end of this year to begin their MCL process, so we are tracking that. But there are these other in-home sources where you can have a lot of products, other things that break down and maybe generate dust or contamination from cleaning products, things that we're not really aware PFAS are in, but could be leading to some of those food issues. So there's a lot of evidence as far as even things like just indoor dust being a huge contribution. There is some guidance on trying to avoid PFAS in consumer products from groups like the Environmental Working Group, but if you've ever gone to that website, it's not exactly the most helpful information. It's basically avoid products with PFAS, but how do you know there's PFAS to avoid buying that product? So that's a lot of the in-home piece, where a lot of this gets sort of into products that are sold across states, or maybe things that people have had in their homes for years to decades now, and a lot of that's more regulated at the federal level. So as far as commercial processing and packaging of food, FDA still has approved uses for PFAS. That includes nonstick cookware, a lot of equipment used in food processing aids, and packaging. FDA has sort of phased out some of the longer chains, but they still have quote unquote short chains or certain fluorotelmer alcohols that are approved. And this also highlights an issue where when we talk about PFAS at the state level, what we would maybe define as PFAS doesn't always line up with what FDA might define as PFAS or what EPA would define as PFAS. There's a lack of an actual definition of PFAS right now. So depending on how you describe that, you may have a definition that differs than what the FDA and EPA would use. And right now, even within EPA, different divisions there have their own different definitions of what counts as a PFAS. So ultimately, as long as FDA isn't regulating that, there's still a lot of ways that PFAS could be ending up in those food products. That's also where, in some ways, New Hampshire does have some control or some action in food processing regulation. So we do have regulation on drinking water, or bottled water, I should say right now, that reflects our drinking water standards. But as far as general food processing, we typically follow what's recommended by FDA. And to understand more about what the state does and doesn't regulate around food processing and food production, I'd really encourage reaching out to the Division of Public Health Services and the Food Safety Program there. One of the reasons a lot of agencies have been slow to sort of act on this is this concern about regrettable substitution. So if we swap out PFAS because we don't want PFAS in it, or are we putting something else in that's more terrifying because we just focus solely on that definition of PFAS? But even with like food packaging, if we go away from food packaging that's PFAS coated because of the concerns, are we just ramping up plastic use and contributing to plastic pollution? So this is sort of where we're getting into the meat and potatoes of, I think, what the committee's more interested in is food production and agriculture. And this isn't something that one state agency or one federal agency has sole regulatory power over. It really takes a lot of communication across different programs, agencies, and departments. PFAS are being found in certain agricultural products across the country, but it's really important to note that bioaccumulation in plants is not the same as in animals. We've seen this in the studies that have come out where PFAS can accumulate, but it's not the same species of PFAS that accumulate in animals as what accumulates in plants. This occurs at different rates. It depends on the plant species. There's a lot of biology that goes into this and why we see those differences, but it's still very poorly studied. It's something that U.S. Department of Agriculture, FDA, various university groups, and some states, including our own, are starting to try to study and explore some. We do realize that some of the way that this can get into plants is either potentially from irrigation water or from things that have been added to the soil. So this could be historical uses of the soil, biosolids maybe that Anthony is going to talk about in a little bit, but also certain forms of pesticides we're now finding they have PFAS in them, and that may be because of the containers that are developed to contain and hold the PFAS, or PFAS may be additives into certain agricultural products. And there also may be nearby sources that emit PFAS that contribute. So we know that biosolids have gotten a lot of attention from what's going on in Maine, but there is some uniqueness to what happened in Maine that isn't quite identical to a lot of other states. But we are trying to understand this. So Maine is doing some work in agricultural products and seeing what does PFAS uptake look like in their soil conditions. And we're actually doing a small project here where we're looking at more garden vegetable studies to try to understand what does PFAS look like for like a garden grower, like a residential user. And can we compare that to existing risk models and maybe come up with some guidance around that? Again, that's still an ongoing study right now. So hopefully this time next year, I can come back and give a presentation on the finalized data from that. But it's something we're trying to understand because we do know that PFAS uptake varies for a lot of reasons. And this can include things that we call abiotic factors. So stuff in the environment like pH, soil conditions, soil chemistry, that might modify whether or not a plant can or cannot take up certain PFAS to any level. So this is something that does require coordination with the New Hampshire Department of Agriculture, Markets, and Food. So by the way, in your report, you call them the Department of Ag. They're not. They have a longer name than that. But they would be the agency that you'd want to coordinate with because they also consider things like food safety in partnership with the Department of Health and Human Services. Now, this is also different than uptake into wildlife and game. I believe earlier this year, maybe this time last year, I came and presented on some of the fish tissue sampling that we had done at DES. And again, animals are not the same as plants. So we see different uptake depending on species, depending on what kind of environment they're interacting with. We have done some ongoing sampling and some other wildlife tissues. I also have a link here to a slightly longer presentation, but it's an overview of some of the partnerships we've developed with academic institutions and the investigations they're going to be carrying out over the next couple of years into PFAS and a lot of our freshwater aquatic resources. And relative to that, we did also put out a report on what it would take to actually develop surface water standards to protect wildlife for their actual health, because we want wildlife to live, but also what it would take to protect them so we can eat them too, because we don't want them just to live. Sometimes we want to eat them. So again, this is a partnership between different state agencies, but we also work with EPA on this one because of how permitting works in the state. And again, a major challenge to this remains that we don't have a state lab for analyzing PFAS in wild game, just like we don't really have the capability or capacity right now to analyze PFAS in a lot of food products. It's just something that's outside of our wheelhouse at this moment. And it does actually take a lot of time, effort, and resources to develop the methods to analyze PFAS in food because of the interference that are found in different kinds of food items. So it's a bit of a whirlwind. I wasn't expecting everyone to read every line on that. I will send out the PDF so you can reflect back on that, but I want to give Anthony his time to talk about biosolids, what they are, what they aren't, and some of the data from the state. So I'm going to try to mute myself so we don't echo into each other.
Welcome, Mr. Drouin. I'm going to hold questions for Dr. Patali until after your presentation, if that's okay. Okay. The floor is yours, Mr. Drouin. Thank you. Oh, but I think you're muted.
Yes, I am. Thank you, Chairman. I gotta get the whole screen. Giving you guys a preview before. So does everybody see this? No? Yeah, you do? Okay, good. Thank you, Chairman, for giving me the chance to present to the committee today on our PFAS investigation. I had Amy Russo had approached me and asked me if we were interested in presenting to you today about The investigation we've conducted since 2017, and we definitely want to educate as many people as possible about the findings we've seen. We've done quite a bit of sampling, obviously, with our biosolid program, but we've also sampled collection system wastewater, meaning we're going out right into the road, popping manholes and sampling that. We've sampled septage. We've also sampled wastewater lagoons and septage lagoons. So we have quite a bit of data, quite a bit of information. I'm only going to be sharing with you parts of it and pieces of it. So if there are further questions about other things related to wastewater and PFAS, I'm always willing and open to have that discussion after this meeting. So real quick, I'm just going to go over who we are, what laws and rules do we follow and govern. The 2018 septage and sludge volumes, that's associated with an actual national survey that was conducted recently, and there's information available about biosolid recycling across the country from that survey. I'm going to go over our 2019 SQC permit modification that we put in the PFAS monitoring requirement and all the work that we did around that during that year. I'm going to go over our most recent SQC PFAS data and collection system data. I'm going to talk about the collection system data, a residential community that we looked at, and the impacts we're seeing from residents versus industry. As well, I'm going to go over a few generators that we have in our program and go over the historical data that we've accumulated since 2017. And then some education outreach we've created. And then what's next kind of for sludge management? What are we looking at for the future? And really the hopes of maybe seeing some new technologies come into the state. So first, we're a 4-person team here at DES. We're within the Water Division, within the Wastewater Engineering Bureau. I am the supervisor administrator of the section. I run the sludge quality certification permitting. Judith Sears Houston is our permitting enforcement engineer. She does all our site and facility permitting. Wade Pelham is our coordinator who does all our education outreach, as well as works on ensuring that there is septage capacity in the state. We do generate quite a bit of septage, as you'll see in my later slide. So that's a very important project for us. And then Jim Talvey is our inspector. He inspects all our vehicles, does all our hauler permitting, and also inspects all our land application and facility permits. So the rules that we specifically, our section works under is the top line there, EMDWQ 800 and EMDWQ 1600. The 800 rules are our sludge management rules. That is where your biosolid land application and biosolid management rules are within. The 1600 rules are the septage management rules, and that's where septage land application and management is within. They are separated because they are essentially two different materials. Obviously, sludge has gone through the wastewater treatment process. It's been treated. Biosolids have been further treated from that. And septage is coming straight from a home that is a domestic source and can be land applied per permit. We don't have much of that left in the state. And we also don't have many septage facilities left in the state. We're currently revising the septage management rules per our 10-year revision schedule. And all of these rules are under RSA 485A, that is the Water Pollution and Waste Disposal Law. Specifically written with that law is a testing program that our section runs on the SQC program. So every year we collect $500 from the permittees. We go out, sample their biosolids for certain constituents, typically VOCs, SVOCs, and metals, but we also do PFAS since 2017. And then we produce a report for legislation that's due every November 1st. So there is a report on record with both Senate and the House in the Environment Ag Committee, and also just in the Senate in general. I think it's the Environment Ag Committee there. But nonetheless, there's a report dating all the way back to the creation of that requirement within the law. So in 2018, I just want to show you some general numbers of what the state generates. So the top 3 numbers here, this is wastewater treatment facilities only. This does not include paper mills nor water treatment facilities. So this is strictly your wastewater treatment facility numbers. So we are recycling about 40,000 wet tons of biosolids annually. We are landfilling about 50,000 wet tons. And we're incinerating approximately 17,000 to 18,000 wet tons of sludge down in Manchester. That is the only incinerator in the state. Most of our biosolids are managed by a company called Resource Management Incorporated, but there are other companies out there that are managing, like AgriSource, and Casella that do manage the biosolids in land application. The landfills that are accepting biosolids are commercial landfills in the state, and there are actually a couple municipal landfills that do accept a small amount of sludge from local generators. We generate over 100 million gallons of septic annually. Over 75% of the state is on private septic systems. So you can imagine we're generating quite a bit of septic annually. We have over 500 trucks permitted to haul septic in the state. We inspect those trucks every 2 years, making sure that they're not leaking and that they're following all our rules for spill plans and everything that's written within those 600 rule hauler requirements. We have 6 operating line landfills in the state. They're generating over 100 million gallons of leachate annually. That has to be processed at a wastewater treatment facility. Back in 2018, most of the leachate was managed inside the state, where there was a chunk of it going out of state that was specifically going to more or less going to the Lowell wastewater plant. That's recently changed, and some of that leachate actually gets trucked down to New Jersey because that was the closest facility that would take it from that landfill. So impacts of PFAS can cause for some long trucking of waste that has to go far away from the state it's generated in. So in 2019, I joined DES in August of 2018. And when I came onto DES, I was the coordinator. And I took over the sludge quality certification program right when I got here. And my first job was to analyze the data that was generated and make up a decision on how we were going to move forward with PFAS and the sludge quality certification program. And my decision was to add the monitoring requirement in there. But I couldn't necessarily add it into the rules right away because there's obviously the rule revision process. We didn't have an approved test method. We don't have a soil standard. There was a lot of things that needed to be done in order for us to revise our rules. However, I could add the requirement in the certificate, which is what I did. So we added the requirement to sample for 9 PFAS compounds. At that time, that was the understanding of compounds we could analyze for. And we did ask for isotope dilution as the method, which is going to be that a method that will hopefully be validated this winter. When that method is validated, I will revise these certificates again to state that they are to use that method and report 40 compounds to us. But what we did, we set up a training right after we did this requirement. We sent them all a letter, and obviously we got a lot of phone calls. What is this? What are we doing here? And how are you doing this? So what we needed to do is set up a training first. So we invited everyone to the Franklin training facility back in 2019. We trained them in that class on what was going on and how to sample for PFAS. But really, there was a lot of uncertainty. There was a lot of uncertainty between labs. There was a lot of uncertainty between samplers. There was just a lot of uncertainty about how to conduct a clean sampling protocol. So I was able to obtain money from our governor's investigation fund. And through that, I was able to then go out and sample all these generators myself using one lab and one sampler. It also allowed me to go out and train each and every facility individually and have an operator and a manager present during those trainings so that they're aware and completely educated on the clean sampling protocol. We do use the NUI-PIC sample guidance and the NEBRA sample guidance, which the NEBRA sample guidance for PFAS was written by Mike Rainey, who is actually a predecessor of mine in this section. After he retired, he wrote that guidance. So the first bit of data I want to show you is the numbers on the bottom there. This is in parts per trillion. And this is a residential community in New Hampshire. So this is really very, very little industry in this community. And what we've done is we've gone out and sampled collection systems in a few different communities in the state. And we've done terminal compound analysis. So that's your standard analysis that's actually being written in the NIPD permits right now for the permittees. But we also did this test called total oxidizable precursor assay. And what we were trying to see here is, can we find and is there hidden PFAS in the wastewater? Because when we were conducting the influent and effluent sampling at the wastewater plants, we noticed that we weren't finding much coming into the plant. And then after oxidation, we were seeing some leaving the plant, and that was really showing how this compound transforms in the process of treatment and then is discharged either in the sludge or wastewater. But what you're seeing here are residential samples taken from manholes or pump stations in this community where they've done where they've oxidized the sample. So they analyze it first and then they oxidize it after. When they do that, they then reanalyze the sample. So what they're showing you here is that from these residential samples, there's quite a bit of PFAS coming out of it. This was pretty surprising to us. Vermont DEC has actually done the same exact sampling and seen the same exact thing. And Vermont DEC was able to get some volume numbers, and they were able to determine that the residents of the community they sample were discharging more PFAS than the cosmetic manufacturing facility and the IBM manufacturing facility in that community. So it really has us wondering what is being washed off of us or what is coming out of us, or essentially what are we eating? And Jonathan kind of alluded to that earlier in his presentation. And I think there needs to be more research done on that from other agencies, whether it's the FDA, the Department of Ag, or Health and Human Services. I think we really need to start looking into this idea and what is happening here and what is in our products that we're using, or it was what is in our food that we're eating. So really surprising for us, and again, surprising for Vermont. And we're continuing this. We just did another community, and we have another community lined up in the later fall here. So we'll end up, when we're done with our funding, we'll have done, I think, 6 communities in the state. And all this information is available upon public request. So what I want to show you first is the 2022 biosolid data. So this is our Class A biosolids that is land applied in the state. What you'll see here is 6 different generators. This is either compost or wood ash stabilized biosolids, meaning they use wood ash to raise the pH in the sludge, which then makes it suitable for land application per the federal rules. So as you can see here, the concentrations on below is all in parts per billion. 0 to 7 is the range. As you see for PFOS, it does range up to a little bit above 6 parts per billion for Hawk Ridge. This is all, for background for PFOS. With the phase 1 of the USGS study, we did see results from 0 to 8 parts per billion. So you could say this is within that range of the phase 1 of the USGS study. But as well, if you want to compare it to another sludge standard that's out there, the only sludge standard out there is the main PFAS sludge standard, which actually still exists today because the law that banned land application did not ban all sludges. So there are still some sludges that are allowed to land apply in Maine. So they still hold that standard. So the standard for PFOS in Maine is 5.2 parts per billion, and the standard for PFOA in Maine is 2.5 parts per billion. So there are some here that would exceed that. So they would obviously have to start resampling, halt distribution when we have that in the rule, but that is not our standard. We are working on that standard right now with the USGS, with the study that they are conducting. And HB 1547 has us presenting our soil standards to legislation by November 2023. This is our Class B program. In order to land apply Class B biosolids, you must obtain a site permit. So right here, let me just go back in the Class A. Your Hawk Ridge and your Merrimack composts are Class A EQ biosolids. That's going to be, you're going to see that land applied on baseball fields or properties, or it can be sold at a garden center. Landscapers can utilize it. So that material has a much more wider utilization. The Woodsville, RMI material, and Claremont material, that typically is a agricultural material. You will not see that land applied on various other fields. Claremont is allowed for ball fields and other activities, but they just don't have the customer base for it. So they typically are selling to or distributing to farmers. Class B program, these are site permitted programs. So these are typically your feed forage farms or dairy farms that are growing feed crops only for their cows or obviously their livestock. You'll see here again, the concentrations range from 0 to 6 parts per billion. PFOS is the most detected compound in all of our investigation. It's detected 88% of the time so far. So PFOS loves carbon. So when it's in that wastewater matrix, it's going to absorb to the carbon and the solids and stay present there. And PFOA tends to be a little bit water soluble. So you'll see PFOA absorb to the sludge, but you'll also see some stay in the water matrix and be discharged in the effluent. Short paper fiber. So the range changes here on the bottom, goes from 0 to 2. So unlike in the main stories, you hear about paper residuals or industrial sludge being a big impactor. That may be the case for some of the residuals they've used out in the state of Maine, but as for our program today, we have PFOS maxing out for Cascade at around almost 2 parts per billion. The rest are obviously below 0.5. And we do get results below 1 part per billion now. With the accuracy of the testing, the method is definitely tuning up in the precision. We're seeing better precision and accuracy within these test reports. This is drinking water residuals. We do allow drinking water residuals to be recycled. It can be blended with a loam only, as long as the arsenic concentration of the final blend does not exceed 11 parts per million. So you do have only 2 generators actually of this residual that is blended into loam and utilized across the state. Again, take note of that range, like the paper mill residuals, goes from 0 to 2. I'm going to show you some historical data all the way back to 2017. So this is the RMI Class A material that's utilized in agriculture. So you can see there were some slight bumps up till 2019, and then we can see a decrease. My curiosity was the person sampling prior to me getting here potentially cross-contaminating the sample. I did notice some things that he was using that were in question, and I removed it when I started sampling in 2019. So I'm not sure if there was some cross-contamination there or if there's some differences in the lab method at that time. A lot of this was brand new back in 2017. So that's why I was showing you initially just the 2022 data, because this method is about to be validated. So, you know, what's the most accurate data to look at, in my opinion, is the most recent. This is Merrimack's compost, as most of you might be concerned about. And let me quickly point out here the scales of each of these compounds. So the top left is PFHXS, the top right is PFNA, the bottom left is PFOA, and the bottom right is PFOS. The scale on the y-axis for each graph is representative per compound. That's why you see it different per compound. So just please take note of that scale difference when we're going through this. Merrimack, this is, again, this biosolid can be utilized in many different areas other than agriculture, but you can see a slight decrease happening there with the biosolids over time. This is Nashua's biosolids. So this is a Class B biosolids utilized at site land application, or land application sites, sorry. This is Monadnock paper residuals. So this material is utilized in agriculture. You don't see this sold in garden centers. You can't just go utilize this anywhere. There are restrictions per the permit. And so you can see Monadnock has a really good procurement program. I work very closely with their environmental manager, and I have a lot of conversations with them about their recycled feedstock they're taking in, because there can be coatings on that cardboard and coatings on that feedstock. So, you know, I've been talking to him and saying, hey, are you having conversations with your vendor? Are you getting test results from your vendor? Are you getting that proof that you're taking in a material that's going to produce a material that's going to be safe, and also that your waste is going to not be as impacted as it could be? And that's very important for these paper mills in New Hampshire, because a lot of them do take in that recycled feedstock to make their products. From what I can tell, a lot of our paper mills in the state here are making different types of packaging paper that necessarily aren't coated with PFAS. They may be coated post-production outside that mill, but from what I can tell so far, I haven't seen much of it, any at all. This is water treatment residuals. So this is, again, blended with loam and then distributed through usually construction projects. It can be land applied on residential properties. There are setbacks. Here is some education outreach that we've created. There's a group that I created called the Northeast Biosolid Improvement Program, which is industry reps all the way from engineer to operator. And what we did is we got together and we created some education outreach for residents and wastewater operators and septic haulers. The residential outreach was to explain how PFAS conveys through our wastewater system and becomes back into our environment as this big old circle. As PFAS can be so much involved in the waste cycle, you can just see how it can come back into our wastewater plant from these management systems. Currently, right now, with wastewater, with sludge management, we have a 3-tiered system. We like to call it a 3-legged stool: land application, landfilling, and incineration. EPA just came out this week stating that those are still 3 viable, strong outlets for the management of sludge, and that they're going to move forward on obviously establishing some limits on PFAS or risk assessment on PFAS, but they are still holding strong on their opinions about that 3-tiered system. You know, what I'd like to see in the future, and what I'll talk about here in a sec, is new technologies like pyrolysis and gasification that can actually destroy PFAS in the sludge and create a pretty inert beneficial product called biochar. And that's really what I'm going to talk about here. So there are some companies in the country that are introducing these new technologies and citing these facilities. They've had success outside of New England, establishing some of this, and we've been keeping our eye on it. We're very interested in this. So gasification and pyrolysis are the two technologies. Essentially, it's burning without oxygen. That's the simplest way I can put it. And what it does is it destroys all the compounds in the sludge and leaves you with pure carbon. And that biochar can be recycled into many different uses. It can be recycled as a land applied carbon source because we still want to add carbon to our soils for climate change mitigation. You can also use it as a fly ash substitute in concrete manufacturing. You can use it as a building material. It can be used as a paint pigment. So there's multiple uses for that biochar. The issue with this type of technology is typically when a company comes in and sites one of these, they let you know that there's going to be quite a bit of truck traffic, so communities don't like that. There has been questions about emissions. Thermal oxidation has been proposed as a solution to that. So, you know, that still needs to be discussed and looked into further. But in the sense of the end product has been proven to be PFAS free. So interested in these technologies. We as the state, you know, we don't have at this time, I don't know of any money that we would create anything like this, but you could probably see private sector coming in to the state once we establish these standards and maybe setting up shop somewhere near you. Definitely keep your eye on it. I think this is something of the future. And that's all I have for now. So I'll leave the floor open for questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Drew. And I feel like I've been drinking from a fire hose, trying to absorb all of the information, but it's very fascinating. I'll open the floor for any questions. But you'll make your presentation available. Like I said, I'm absorbing so much, it's hard to formulate questions.
I will definitely, I have this in PDF. I'll email it over to Nancy right after the meeting so she can share with all of you. And like I said before, I'm always open for further conversation, and you know, all our information is available for public requests. So.
Okay, but we do have, I think what I'm taking away is in our interim report, we did have discussions about biosolid regulation, but what I'm hearing from you, those already exist in rules.
Well, no, the biosolid sludge standards or screening levels that exist are the main DEP standards. So I was comparing that to the only standard that exists. What is happening is HB737, we will be proposing the soil PFAS standards to legislation by November 2023. From that soil standard, I will back calculate the sludge standard and put that into our 800 rules underneath the metals section. So we have a section in our 800 rules where there are maximum contamination limits, and PFAS will be put into that section.
Okay.
With all the other contaminants. So we are going to be regulating PFAS into the future. We just need to have the science line up so we can have a defensible standard that we know we're going to stand by.
Okay, thank you. Any questions for, yes, Dr. Woods?
Thanks. Just not being a pessimist, but always looking at unintended consequences. For either one of you, as you process and mitigate any of the PFAS materials that we know are create biologic difficulties, in the process of mitigating that, is there any concern about just transforming it to a form of the perfluorocarbons that we're not testing at the moment and creating a new problem? I can't hear you.
Both of you are on mute.
Yes, yeah. Sorry,
Okay.
we have two computers next to each other and we're trying to avoid a stereo effect. So there's sort of two ends of this that I would think about. So there's the treatment end, right, of either pyrolysis or whatever other things we're trying to manage on the waste end, where, like Kathy Beam has discussed with you around like the oxidation with PFAS, right? There is always that concern of what's the byproduct of that. That's always going to be an issue, but it'll remain an issue as long as there is more PFAS on the market coming in. And as long as there keeps being this approach of saying, okay, we're going to ban this PFAS, or this definition of certain PFAS. And if industry switches over to a new thing without being given guidance on what is acceptable, that still presents that risk of what's being produced on the down end waste stream. So there's still a lot of this on that sort of industry and commerce side that isn't being really addressed. And that is a huge challenge when it comes to regulating PFAS, because we can keep developing more analytical methods and just keep developing more standards for PFAS as we have the ability to measure them. But your point of what's the unintended byproduct, that's not just been an issue with PFAS, it's been an issue with other contaminants in the past, where there's this sort of frenetic race of, I want to ban the buzzword that's upsetting to me today, without thinking about what am I pushing industry towards without giving them any guidance. And that's been an issue historically with toxicology, risk assessment, and commercial products. And we're basically barreling in that same direction today, because there's the piece of what chemicals do we put in to give consumers the same products that they like to have in their lives right now that we know is safe, without actually defining what safe means. So that's a sort of more of a federal issue. But there's this piece too, right? So Anthony was pointing out, we have landfills that are receiving recycled paper products or food packaging products that will break down and release PFAS. The regrettable substitution to that is, okay, outright just ban all consumer products, right? That would fix that if you ban anything with PFAS in it, but then you might have people shifting over to plastics or siloxane materials that we still don't have any safety data on. So that's always the concern of, the waste end, we're going to keep dealing with this as long as things are being put on the market that have these compounds in it.
So would it be fair to summarize it by saying, yes, you are aware of the byproduct issue, but only pursue it actively as indicated, shall we say?
It's partially as we can detect it, because we know that there are other byproducts of PFAS coming out, but there's a huge issue still of detection, where on the waste end, we are constantly racing.
So you're not ignoring. It's not being ignored, put it that way.
For us on the wastewater end, Dr. Woods, I don't like, as a scientist, I never like to bank everything on one test report, right? But I did just recently receive a test report from a community. We did top assay, that total oxidizable precursor test. We did it on the influent and the effluent of the plant. And we actually, the way we do collection system sampling is we wait on the retention time. So if the retention time in the collection system out in the streets 12 hours, we're sampling the influent 12 hours after the last collection point. And then if there's retention time in the plant of 24 hours, then we're sampling the effluent 24 hours after that influent sample. We did top assay on both the influent and effluent. I saw a huge difference on the influent, telling me that there's a lot coming into the plant that's unknown. But the effluent had a very low difference. So what is that telling me? That's telling me that the plant was oxidizing that precursors, all those precursors, mostly from what we can tell. And what we were seeing in the effluent and most likely the sludge was most likely the end products. However, there still needs to be a lot of research and studies done on that. Right. But just from that first report, it has me questioning, are the plants fully oxidizing these precursors through their oxidation energy of the treatment in general? So I now have ideas of an RFP this spring where we're potentially going to look at all the treatment, because there's many different wastewater treatments. Not every single wastewater plant is the same. So now I want to look at what's the oxidation energy of this plant, what's the oxidation energy of this plant, and this plant, and this plant, and what are the results from that? And are we seeing this? And is that influent test requirement written in the NIFTY's permit, is that actually a good test for them? Is that giving any good information? Should it be something else? So, there's a lot of work that still needs to be done, but we are seeing things, and our hypotheses maybe aren't getting answered or are getting answered, but at least we're making ground on our understanding.
Any other questions for Mr. Druin or Dr. Yes, Ms. Allen.
Great presentation. It was fabulous. Thank you. One of the issues that comes up repeatedly in this area of 4 to 5 towns of vast contamination is the fish and wildlife and game sampling. So we've done some sampling, and I've read the reports across the state with, random samples of various points. So we have a set. But here we have this known area of contamination where, to me and others, the goal is to stop exposure, reduce exposure as much as we can, because we've had it for many, many years. So I'm really frustrated to know, why hasn't there been, is it this thing when there's a identified responsible party, they're supposed to get all the work plans? Does that preclude you from doing what I would expect to be a better sampling here of game, wildlife, and fish in this area? We did have one finding, in your report, but that covered all in New Hampshire. We have, as you know, many more waterways, and we do have people who fish and hunt, and it's turkey week, I think this week kicked off, where you can shoot turkeys and they're all over the place. So my concern is people are very unaware and could very well be ingesting venison.
So I would say at the heart of it, just like with any other chemical contaminant that we have in the state, the heart of it comes down to cost, and the state doesn't have a funded program for routinely sampling. So sampling one single fish is $500 just for the lab analysis. That's not including any staff time that would go out into collecting that fish or planning, so let's just put staff time to the side. Let's pretend people like Anthony, me, and Joe Ayotte work for free. So there's that cost there just to the analysis, which, the fish sampling that we did was because the legislature gave us $6 million to do research, and we went out and did that preliminary study. We do not have an established monitoring program for PFAS or a lot of other contaminants that we know are in the state. It's something that the food safety lab here is not funded for that, to do that kind of broad sampling. We do have a mercury program, but that's based on people voluntarily bringing in fish. And really for the last few years, it's just been a couple of DES employees that have brought fish in for mercury testing. A lot of people aren't really bringing in samples for us to look at, so our mercury data is dropping off. So it is fundamentally an issue of cost. Now, in the case where there's a responsible party, if we have evidence to push for looking for that kind of investigation, we try to encourage that sort of sampling. But there's also still the limit with PFAS of there's so much other game and animal biological products that we don't know how it's accumulated. It's difficult right now to have the evidence to say, we know that this will accumulate to a certain level in this species, and that merits that sort of assessment. And then just another piece of that with data gaps is we don't really know what consumption patterns in the state look like for wildlife and game. We can have anecdotal reports of people saying, my cousin hunts for this animal all the time. Under risk assessment regulations, how we look at things, that's not the kind of data we can actually use. And our program has tried to address some of that, because recently we partnered with Dartmouth and UNH to do a survey of New Hampshire resident fish consumption, because until now we've never actually had that data, right? So that's one of the things we're trying to address, some of these gaps where we can, but there's just ultimately we don't have programs funded to do this sort of widespread monitoring for PFAS or PCBs, heavy metals, a lot of these other contaminants that we know are occurring in the state.
So who funded the venison sampling in the seacoast, and the some sampling in the estuary was done also for shellfish, I believe, and things like that? And we know that area is affected, so that was a very helpful data point for the community.
So the venison sampling was funded by Fish and Game because they had a very small amount of federal dollars left over that the federal level Fish and Wildlife was gracious enough to allow them to spend that on PFAS sampling. But otherwise, Fish and Game is not funded to do routine contaminant monitoring like that. The shellfish monitoring started because the Air Force is the responsible party out there. They're required to do that initial screening. But based off of that data, what we've leveraged here at the state is partnerships with academic institutions to get grants to do more of that sampling. And in that same way, we did that one-time fish study across southern New Hampshire. It wasn't randomized across the state. It was focused in southern New Hampshire. We had northern sites as our reference sites, but if you look at the map of those lakes that we did for the fish sampling, it was focused in the southern portion of the state. We've used that to leverage our partnership with Dartmouth and USGS. Hi, Joya, thanks again. We're actually just got funded with Dartmouth to do more sampling of freshwater organisms in the southern portion of the state. So it's the thing right now, if the department isn't funded to do it, we don't have monitoring programs like that, but we are trying to figure out how can we partner with academics who can pursue grants to do this. But again, that's not a long-term monitoring program. It's not something that's sustainable for years to come or will cover everything. It really has to be targeted at certain questions.
So our elected officials here have to look for the money is the short answer, because we do have all kinds of surpluses. So I appreciate that explanation. It's frustrating, of course, but no, we have to find a way to solve that, because I think it's definitely an exposure pathway in the area.
Ms. Murphy, did you have a question?
I did, thank you. Jonathan, you actually just made me think of something. If the Department of Defense is responsible for doing that kind of stuff over at Pease as an identified responsible party, and we have St. Gobain identified as a responsible party here, and we know, where St. Gobain sits is right along the water. Why would, and I miss, maybe not something you can answer, but I'm wondering why that responsibility isn't being put on St. Gobain for the waterways and things that, I know we need money to do all these things, and I think we're all frustrated the same way, but it seems like the responsible party, we have one close to our waterways. Why are they not being held responsible for testing in those areas, which are really close to.
So that's more of a question for Andy Fuller and formerly Jeff Martz. Jeff Martz is transitioning out of that, and we're transitioning Andy Fuller.
But Andy.
But that's as far as where are they at in the investigation and what's being pursued, right? The Pease Air Force Base, setting PFAS aside, has been a active site for years to decades. So they're just at a different stage in their investigation than where things are at in southern New Hampshire. So you'd have to bring Andy Fuller in to sort of discuss where are they at and what are they looking at. I know there was some issues with trying to get fish sampling, and because of drought years and because of just what they could sample in certain areas. Again, usually the way these investigations work is you don't ask carte blanche, sample everything under the sun all at once. You start at certain places to get that initial data and then make decisions from there. So that would be the thing I would recommend, reaching out to Andy Fuller as far as getting those kind of answers, or getting like sort of a summary of where they're at and considering those other pathways. I know right now, because so much focus in the past has been PFAS in drinking water is the most serious issue that needs to be addressed right away. That's where they've been putting resources. So again, you just have to check in with Andy Fuller and Jeff Martz.
Okay, thanks, John.
Okay, any other questions for either Dr. Batali or Mr. Druin? Representative LaSalle, do you have any questions?
No, thank you.
Okay, oh yes, Mr. Preventure.
Yeah, real quick, I was just wondering, Mr. Druin can make comment on the two methods of treating the sludge that produce the carbon-free, PFAS-free carbon. What is your opinion on the economics of that on real scale? Is that something that is extremely costly, or just ballpark?
Yes. So it is actually very costly. You know, I've heard up to the tune of 15-20 million to get like a pretty good sized facility up and running. And then you got to run it, right? And so then will their management fees be higher than a landfill's management fees? I'm not sure, but obviously they probably would be hired for that return on investment concept. really what they're looking at, and my conversations with the two companies have been, is that they're waiting to see what our standards will be, because if our biosolids are, you know, here and the standards here, they're not seeing much of a business model to come in here and set up shop, right? Because then they may not have a lot of material, and then they may have been being like an out-of-state generator, because if our biosolids are safe, they got to take in material, you know, so interstate commerce law doesn't stop the flow of that waste. Where, you know, where's the cost benefit there? You know, it's all a matter of, I guess, with the public in New Hampshire, if they were to push, you know, for this technology more, then, you know, we would then move forward and obviously see that being implemented, but it is quite costly.
Thanks, that's what I thought.
You know, I'd like to see, you know, all the wastewater plants could have a dryer and keep the water all at the wastewater plant. That'd be a huge win. But then that's even costly for each municipality to even get that part of the process, because you need to dry the biosolids before you pylorize it. So it always has to be dried. You can't just put a wet cake in the system.
Okay, I'm not seeing any other questions. I do have one though. Dr. Patali, one of my concerns in Merrimack is that there was a clearing of land around Saint-Gobain, where there's going to be some development, and trees were removed. And I was wondering, do you have any data on the uptake of PFAS by trees? Because
There's been
if there is an
only a
uptake,
handful of studies.
we're just spreading the PFAS to wherever those trees were taken.
Yeah, so there's only been a handful of studies that tried to look at that, and really that's looking more in like leaves and needles more so than actual tree material. And the issue with PFAS is they don't just evenly distribute in every part of a tree, right? So if you take like a tree ring, there's different material parts of a tree. So it's really hard to estimate how much PFAS we moved around by that. But just given what we've seen in most studies, there's probably some detectable level. But again, is that long chains? Is that short chains? What's the actual mass balance? That's just something that hasn't been really well studied. There's a really small body of literature around plant uptake, let alone tree uptake of PFAS.
Chairman Rung, you actually bring up a good point with that. Leaf and lawn debris is recycled as a compost at transfer stations and then distributed throughout the state. Most of the time, a distributor will come in, take that material, and then sell it throughout the whole region. So each municipality generating their leaf and lawn debris compost then sees that material leave the town and move around. So then you see that PFAS potentially spreading, that big circle I was talking about. How waste moves, PFAS moves.
Yeah, that is my concern, because ideally when there is contamination, we want to keep it as isolated as possible. It's sort of like cleaning up an ink stain. You know, sometimes you try to clean up, you're just soiling a greater area.
And interstate commerce law plays a big role into how sludge and waste is managed. So we see, you know, sludges and biosolids cross borders to be managed. We have biosolids leave our state. Merrimack compost, for instance, 85% of it is actually land applied in Massachusetts. 15% of it's land applied in New Hampshire, where then you have 100% of Nashua's land applied in New Hampshire. You know, there's many, the way it's distributed is it changes.
Okay. All right. I want to thank you both very much. I don't see any other questions. Thank you. And if you could forward your presentations, I guess Amy Russo can put them on the PFAS website, and then I can link to that from the House Statutory Committee website that we have. Thank you very much. I'm going to move on now. Dr. Bush was unable to join us today, so Ms. Rogers is here. Welcome. And just want to know if there is a DHHS update to share with us today.
Hi, Representative Rung and members of the Commission. Thank you. My name is Abby Rogers. I'm the Legislative Liaison for the Division of Public Health Services, and I am sitting in for Katie Bush today. We just have a few updates, which Katie had provided for me to share with the Commission. The first is that the Cancer Program is prepared to share an update from the Merrimack Cancer Report. We're meeting internally to see whether that might be available in either November or December. I know that The preference was November, and we should have an answer on that by early next week for you. One of the other things I want to mention is the New Hampshire Environmental Health Conference will be held on October 27th in Concord at the Grappoti Center, and that is open to anyone who would like to register. I can send my notes to Nancy Murphy, and you can have that in your notes. There's a link to register. The department continues to monitor PFAS-related work with our federal partners at ATSDR and EPA, and following the recent National Academies report. DHHS continues to explore opportunities to conduct PFAS-related outreach and education, such as creating a summary document for healthcare providers, and we look forward to participating in the next Nurse Practitioner Conference, which is scheduled for April 2023 in collaboration with PEG, DeTulio, and DES. And I think that's it that Katie had provided to me for today to share with you.
Great. And if you could forward that to me and Ms. Murphy for the minutes, that'd be great. Are there any questions, Ms. Rogers? Representative LaSalle, do you have any questions?
No, thank you.
Okay. Notice I've been remembering to ask you, right?
No, you've been doing super.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much, Ms. Rogers. I appreciate the update. And now we're to, I know I was going to have a meeting just dedicated to going over this report, but I really wanted to get updated on the work that Dr. Patali and Mr. Druin have been doing. So I'm hoping that we can have a good discussion about the interim report. And if we can all reach a consensus on our recommendations, that we can vote to approve that to be submitted. If not, if we need to do more work on this, I will call a special meeting of the commission probably in a week or two, so we can meet that November 1st deadline. As I explained in an email to you when I shared this third draft, the process that I used was, if you remember back in the summer, I had charged each of our subcommittees to present legislative recommendations and non-legislative recommendations that we want to make to the Senate, the House, and the governor. So I want to thank all the committees for doing that. What I did is I compiled them all into a document. There was some redundancy in recommendations between the environmental subcommittee and the health subcommittee. So I removed those redundancies to just keep one. And then I met with the policy committee met. There were only a couple of us that attended that meeting, but we did iron out some issues that we felt would be areas of contention, particularly with the legislative recommendations, and I can go through those. But we left that meeting in consensus, and that was reflected in draft 2. Also, the communications subcommittee had met to go over the outcome of the policy subcommittee, and we made some further changes. Mainly, I know that Mr. Badazian and the environmental subcommittee had written a great environment, a summary, an environmental summary report, and that was the only one we had. So we thought, well, let's make that the prime area, we just called it investigative report, so that it could really speak for the whole commission. And then I also met to reach draft 3. I met with Mr. Wimsatt and Dr. Bush and Ms. Rogers to just review if there were any areas that we felt that there was that we should spend particular attention, or that maybe weren't consistent with the agency practice, the department practice, or just kind of that. And so we ironed out some of those, which I'll go through. And I'm trying to think, there was something else. Oh, and then Dr. Bush had sent me her annual report. If you remember, she does a report to other organizations. So I kind of wordsmithed that just to make sure it only applied to the purview of our commission, the activities that are listed in statute for our commission. So I did that. Also earlier on, there were some recommendations that were outside the purview of our statutory authority. So I set those up separately to be recommendations for either general, state, or federal action. So that sort of summarizes how we got to draft 3. I'm going to go over it quickly, and then we'll go over each area to see if there are any issues people have. The first page is pretty much just boilerplate with who the members of the commission are, what our charge is. The second page, I drafted an executive summary. There were some comments from DES on that, which I've incorporated. Actually, most of that was just getting updated numbers. I wanted to make sure that we had the most recent counts for impacted households. And also, Mr. Wimsatt offered a history of the bypass events for St. Gobain. Even though they're pretty specific for an executive summary, I wanted to include that. So I kept that in. And I guess what I'll do, and then the background section was just pretty much lifted from last year's report, just so if somebody's reading this without reading the previous 2 reports, it gives them some background about what the issue is. So up to that point, are there any questions or concerns people have? Great, thank you. Okay, then the next section, I took the recommendations that we had made in our last year's report, and I wanted to provide an update on progress. And, oh, actually, no, I'm sorry. In this section, it pretty much I took just from what Representative Mooney, if you notice, every month during our legislative season, she was giving an update on PFAS-related bills. So this pretty much summarizes that. Mr. Wimsatt was kind enough to remind me that there were a couple bills that had title changes. So I did go in and swap out the old titles for the new titles. And so, you know, that it just kind of summarizes where we stand at the end of this biennium on those bills. And then the next section was progress on our 2022 non-legislative recommendations. We did have a recommendation to provide communication to our impacted communities. So DES and DHHS reminded me of some of those communication sessions that we had, or you know, other types of communication we had with our communities. And updated about our Londonderry citizen rep. Thank you, Mr. Dunn. And just that the cancer report was updated. Even though that was updated in December of 2021, it occurred after we had submitted our 2021 annual report. So it actually becomes an update for this report. And just kind of listed some of the recommendations we had made last year were outside the purview of our authority. So I didn't include those. And that was one of the impetuses for me to have that separate section this year, so that our recommendations are really restricted to what is within the realm of that statute. And so then I took the narrative that Mr. Badazian had forwarded to me, and we called it investigative summary. But then I did get one from Dr. Bush. So we do have 2 narratives. One is on executive summary environmental and executive summary health. I don't know, has anyone had any comments on that? Okay. And then it pretty much just captures what we've done and learned this year from an environmental perspective. And then I took Dr. Bush's narrative, that was a compilation of her report to other organizations, and edited that. So I just pulled out what applied to HB737. And it goes on about the cancer report and how the 2018 study had been updated and gone on to, help inform the 2021 study. talks about the cancer concern review team, talks about their new website, communications from DHH on water quality, and then the work done by Appletree as far as their communication to our region. And are there any questions on that section of the report? Ms. Murphy?
Thank you. I just have a question in terms of the listing of the 2022 legislative progress, all of the bills. I think there's like 13 of them there, and I think 3 of those passed. Are we making a recommendation that some of those bills should be refiled in addition to what, you know, the new ones that we have in the I think it's, what is it, page 9?
We can certainly do that when we get to our recommendations.
Okay.
We could, you know, I would definitely entertain a suggestion to do that.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, now we're getting into areas where, when I had some of my one-on-ones with people, where there still remains some, you know, just some different perspectives on what we should include. So the following recommendations are made for New Hampshire legislative actions, and these would be items that would require filing of a bill. You know, there's no other way I could say it. So when I had done that consolidation of recommendations, there were several that had to do with funding DES to do this, funding DES for that. And I felt that it would be, I had a conversation with Mr. Wimsatt about how can we do this most efficiently that really enabled us to do things that we really want done. And one of the ideas that came from that conversation is to establish a PFAS response fund. And because what happens with DES now, and I think we also heard it from Dr. Patali, is that many times they have to go to this fund. They might need money for testing, and they can't get it from this fund. They go to this fund, but this fund will only test the first round. So people that need to have testing to get the POET system, there's no money for that. So it just seemed like a patchwork to really be able to address our PFAS needs. So we thought if we had legislation to set up a PFAS response fund and leave it to DES to establish rules on the eligibility or context of accessing those funds would be more efficient, because they wouldn't have to rely on other grants or other modes that might delay or not fund things that need to be funded. So I took all of those fund requests, the bills that would require funding, put them into this one called PFAS Response Fund. It would be used for testing and monitoring PFAS levels in groundwater, stormwater, and surface water associated with municipal landfills and firefighting. Yes, Mr. Ayotte.
Thank you, Representative Rung. One question, I see that testing and monitoring in several places, and I wonder if we can't insert also scientific investigation. I know that's a little close to home, but to me, the whole process of monitoring works best when it's coupled with investigation, because you can, in my view, better address things through monitoring, or monitor more effectively where it needs to be done and where it doesn't need to be done. There's some similar, just to also go on, I guess there was something up in the previous section in the environmental part where it said, I think it was on page 7, third paragraph, and it mentioned, I can find it. Yeah, it mentioned monitoring, you know, repeat sampling inside and outside the outer boundary is being done to obtain better understanding of the dynamics of contamination. And I just wonder, it made me wonder what exactly that was or meant, because there are a number of things that could be done, including estimation of travel times and directions of travel of contaminants and things like that, that might really help address, you know, where to monitor, how frequently to monitor, identification of areas that weren't suspected to be problematic, things like that. So I just think if we can add investigation into there somehow, it would be good.
I agree wholeheartedly. And that was going to be my next question.
Sorry, that was a little long-winded, but.
No, that's okay. So if we edit that to be file legislation to establish a PFAS response fund for scientific investigation, testing and monitoring PFAS levels. And I would probably just put a period after that.
Yeah.
And because vague can kind of be a good approach because we don't know what might happen. But we want to be able to address, we don't want to put ourselves in a box with how we can respond to discovery or issues with PFAS. Okay, so that's what I've done. I've struck the words after levels, and I've inserted scientific investigation between for and testing on the first recommendation. Okay.
That's great by
Okay.
me. I hope
All
others
right,
are
thank you
okay.
very much, Mr. Ayotte. And the second one, was an area where there was a little bit of contention about the approach. We had received, I forget if it was the health or the environmental, probably the health subcommittee, had added file legislation to create a statewide registry to collect and monitor health impacts cited in scientific literature as being linked to PFAS exposure. The registry will not contain patient identifiers. That last sentence was added during the policy subcommittee because there was really concern that this bill would not have any likelihood of passing if there were patient identifiers. So the policy committee added that. And I agreed to that because really, a health registry, we want to collect data of health impacts. It really doesn't matter if it happens to Jane Doe or John Doe or Janet Doe. It's really want to get that data. And that's the number one priority. So that was included. Now, DHHS, when I had a conversation with Ms. Rogers and Dr. Bush, they felt a good approach, a primary approach would be, well, we have a lot of ways we collect data throughout the state. Why don't we have a bill that funds a feasibility study to see how we can leverage those different collection modes in order to gather the data we need on PFAS health impacts. So that was one thing that they recommended, and then that would inform what a health registry would look like. Subsequent conversations I had, with Ms. Mesmer, she was really adamant that we needed to get a bill in on the health, on the health registry. These can be both done. It's not like we have to pick one or the other. So I'm of the opinion, and I want to get your opinion on this, is to keep both and leave it up to those legislative committees to decide if, what approach. Should we take a feasibility approach or should we go right into the health registry? Because during that legislative process, there'll be public hearings on these bills if we file these as two separate bills. And there could be more information, more input by subject matter experts. And I think I think that's sort of the approach I want to take. And I want to hear from you what you think. Should we decide on one or the other, or should we allow both to move forward? Okay, so I'm going to put it on the floor to have both move forward. Unless I hear a disagreement, we're going to go on to the next recommendation. Okay, so we're going to make those. So DHS, okay, so it'll say file legislation to create a feasibility study to understand how blah, blah, blah. Okay, all right, so that'll be number 3, file legislation. Okay, and if I miss seeing a hand go up, just speak up. Then number 4 would be resubmit legislation from 2017 requiring agencies to enter into a memorandum of agreement to enable cross-agency data sharing. Both DES and DHS felt that this is already occurring, but the bill that established this is lapsing. So, and it's also it may also be a recommendation of the, oh, I'm sorry, it's not HB, it's Senate Bill 85. Commission. So I'm not worried that it may be redundant with the recommendation that comes out of HB 85, because there'll only be one bill that would be accepted. I think the question is, do we need to renew that lapsing bill, to resubmit it? Do we need it in, also, do we need it in statute that the agencies do have a memorandum of agreement to enable cross-agency data sharing?
Yes.
Representative Healy, do you have a question?
Oh, I just said yes. I was just agreed with it. Yes.
Okay. All right, so I'm gonna go, I don't really see any dissent. I'm gonna go ahead and keep number 4. And that note that's highlighted, this may also be, I'm just gonna cross that out. What typically happens if we make that legislative, you know, if someone here, a legislator submits that bill and a legislator from Senate Bill 85 submits the bill, OLS is only gonna take one of them. So that's what will happen. Okay, so now the recommendation number 5 is to file legislation to fund and conduct an evaluation and assessment of cancer rates, like the 2018 report delivered to the Commission for the town of Merrimack for all towns known to be impacted by emissions on a zip code or tract level, blah, blah, blah. I'm gonna strike that on a zip code. We don't really need that. So what this would be is we would fund a study of cancer rates for Bedford, Litchfield, and Londonderry. That would, you know, it would be like our Merrimack cancer report, but it would be getting information from those other communities. When I met with Ms. Rogers and Dr. Bush, and Ms. Rogers, correct me, but I think DHHS is moving ahead on that anyway. Is that correct?
Yes, our cancer program is meeting internally this week in preparation for presenting to this commission in November. We would be able to have Whitney Hammond discuss that feasibility of that and when that might occur at the November meeting. That's the information I have about that. That meeting hasn't taken place, but we would have that information to either share before the November meeting or presenting that at the commission meeting.
Okay.
On what next steps might look like with that data request.
Okay, because right now our November meeting would be on, well, it wouldn't be on the 11th is Veterans Day. I don't think we'll meet then, but maybe on the 10th or the 14th. That's still within the time frame for LSRs to be accepted. So I'm kind of the mind of keeping this, and we can still file it, but we could still not file it. It would be mainly a placeholder. I don't know if Ms. Murphy, did you have a comment or question?
Yeah, I was just, thank you. I was just looking and thinking, you know, it's absolutely important that we both fund and conduct something like this. But I think this is right in line with the Registry of Health Impacts that we're talking about. I mean, cancer is not the only health outcome that we're seeing here. And, you know, I mean, I like the idea absolutely of supporting this. And I know the cancer registry program is already in place. But I just wonder if there's a way, when we're talking about funding and conducting this for cancer rates, that we do the same thing for, I mean, we're 6 years in here with still no data collection for anything other than cancer rates. And that was in place for other things, of course, across the state. So I don't know. I mean, I think it's important and you know, I certainly support that. But I wonder if there isn't a way to sort of consolidate funding and conducting that you know, not only the assessment of cancer rates, but of the other health impacts that we're seeing here. There's a way to, you know, not just isolate out cancer rates.
Yeah, Ms. Rogers.
Thank you. I just wanted to share a little bit, if I can, Representative Rung, about our discussion about the potential registry. In our discussion, we talked about, you know, the various registries that have been proposed in the legislature. I understand the work of this commission very much would like to have a registry or a data collection about other health conditions related to possible PFAS exposure. And I shared with Representative Rung that we have had over the last couple of years, legislative requests, one for an ALS registry, which was a bill that turned into the Rare Disease Advisory, where we do look at, causes of rare diseases and sort of rare disease advocacy. And then, of course, SB 85 does a lot of work in environmentally triggered chronic disease. We had a request through a bill last session, HB 1644, related to 5G, and there was a proposed registry component to that, which would look at RF sensitive individuals and would be a sort of a radio frequency sensitive individuals, and if there were biologic effects related to that exposure. We did a very significant fiscal note about how that registry might look. And there was a pretty big fiscal impact to the department. When you propose a registry, when you think about like how hard could it be to collect that, well, it is if it's somehow it's self-reported, and there are certain technology platforms that we would have to implicate to buy and organize. But one of the biggest problems we had was with like validity of the data, and just, if it was a self-report registry, having the ability to validate that and keep that data confidential, if you will. So, if the commission wanted to move forward with one of those recommendations, I would suggest having an appropriation attached to that, just to be able to cover, what we would come in and say would be over $500,000 for that, to be able to kind of do what is being prescribed, certainly in other registry bills.
Okay, so for item number 2, then we would modify that to be file legislation to create and fund a statewide registry. Does that address that?
I think that would be helpful in having that legislation be successful, to have have an appropriation attached to that.
Okay. All right, and then we have a cancer registry. We get data on cancer.
Yes.
So I actually see, Ms. Murphy, that number 5, the getting cancer reports on the other communities and funding a registry are actually two. I don't see how we can really combine them, because one, we don't have data, and the bill would be we're going to fund the collection of the data, and the other one is taking the data and analyzing it and reporting it. So my suggestion would be keep those two separate.
I agree. And actually by adding the funding component to number 2, I think that solves what I was thinking.
Okay.
So that makes sense. Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions on that? Now we come to the next one, and I think this was really addressed through the presentation we had today, a bill requiring PFAS to be added to a list of test requirements for biosolids to be permitted for land spreading and compost. I heard from Mr. Druin that that's actually going to happen next year. Is that true, Mr. Druin? It's going into rules?
So we have the monitoring requirement has been written in the certificate for every SQC permit holder since 2019. So every single permittee that is allowed to distribute bulk biosolids in the state of New Hampshire already has that written in their permit. What we're going to be doing, once we have the soil standard established and we back calculate the sludge standard, and then the test method has been validated, then we're going to implement that into our rules as an official rule. But in this interim period where we have no validated method and no soil standard, we're kind of in this, it's the same thing that the EPA has done with the NIPDI permits. They've added PFAS monitoring requirements in the NIPDI permit, but there's no limit yet. So it's essentially, you got to start monitoring, you got to get us the information, standards coming. And the same things with the biosolid program.
All right, that's helpful. So I think we can strike number 5.
And if you guys are interested in any of that data, we have all that data, tabulated since 2017, so you can observe.
And we will have an opportunity in a year if we find that we do need a legislative remedy that we can go back. But as far as this filing period, I think this might be premature.
In fact, the NIPT permit revisions are going to have pretty much almost every single wastewater plant in the state monitoring their sludge, whether they recycle to land app or not. So the small general permit that has been revised, those are your water plants in the state. They actually have that requirement written already in their permit. And once that method is validated, 6 months after that, and the EPA tells them to, they have to start monitoring. So soon, in the near future, we're going to have data on every plant. Which will be
Okay. All right. I'm going to strike number 5 then from the recommendations. All right. Moving on. What is now remains number 6 is file legislation to amend real estate conveyancing information disclosed by seller or seller's agent and notification requirements. It would be as if someone's selling a property, this bill would require them to disclose that they have received notice from DES that they're within 500 feet of a contaminated well, or if they, or if there has been PFAS contamination of their well. So I don't know, I think I think that would be a great bill. I heard from a person, this was on Stebbins Pond Road. I heard from a real estate broker on the Seacoast who, an agent for a buyer's agent to buy a home. And they had no clue that property, they've done their own research and found out it is on the list for a POET system. But they have no other information. I think that's something the seller should have disclosed. The buyer was lucky they had their own agent that did their homework on that. Okay, so we're going to keep those. Before I move on to non-legislative recommendations, is there anything I've missed or anything anyone wants to add to the report?
Just to clarify that last one, does that add PFAS to the test panel also upon property transfer? Because there are areas that we don't know or aren't on that list that haven't been identified. So if they're not tested, like radon and arsenic and all kinds of bacterias and whatever the heck else is on that list, then people won't be aware. Because I hear this all the time from people. They come to town, they read stuff on Facebook or other towns in the area, and then they get their well tested on their own, and then they find it's there, and they feel like, wow, why didn't anybody tell me this? I don't know if the owners knew or not, like no one may know is what I'm trying to say unless they test it.
I'll find out, Ms. Allen. I think it's really just adding PFAS to those lists. So if to those items, I'm not sure if those items are required to be tested, but it becomes part of the purchase and sales agreement where a buyer could demand, okay, I want
to be tested. You don't have to force people to, because how can you enforce having, DES send a notice or realtors disclose it? Because they should be doing this ethically. But I heard this from a person in Bedford a few weeks ago that it was an appalling story. I won't share in the interest of time, but I was really angry. So if it were a test requirement, just like your property inspection, it would be up to everybody to negotiate and put in a water system or whatever they want to do.
Representative Cretion, did you have a question?
Yeah, I was just going to ask whether, I guess it sounds like you just sort of, oh my gosh, what is the word I'm looking for? Just sort of resolved it. But yeah, asking if there are precedents for other things where it's like, if this has been tested, you must disclose, but not that you necessarily need to undergo testing, or if we wanted to make it something where it was like, yes, you have to test for this, like you have to test for lead paint before you can sell or transfer a property. Sounds like the latter.
Regulate it, we're in this mess because we left it to what people were supposed to do the right thing, right? So unfortunately, I don't believe in over-regulation, but we have to regulate it. It has to be added to the list and part of that water test when you buy a home.
Yeah, I have to check, but what I understand this recommendation would do is that it would add into statute PFAS as something that could be subject or required testing as part of the condition of the purchase and sales agreement. I mean, a buyer could waive that, but it would bring notice that, okay, here are some things that I think what it means, and I'll get clarification on this, but I think what it means is that if the buyer doesn't require the testing, they have to sign off on it.
So does the buyer have the option of waiving bacteria testing, radon, arsenic, whatever they test in private water? I don't think they do.
Yeah, I'll double check. I'll get back on that.
Keep in mind, the EPA is saying there's no safe amount, and they're setting MCL's rulemaking kicks off next month, and it'll be here at the end of next year. So that only will regulate municipal water supplies, but it's a water safety issue. So it's really important to have that in there. And I know this bill, when it briefly came up, talk of it, it had immense pushback a couple years back.
Yeah, I mean, I think it should be part of the sales and purchase agreement that these are things that, can be tested. But I do believe the buyer should have the right to decline. Like they could still buy the home if it has PFAS that's higher than the MCL, because they may decide, oh, well, I'm going to put a reverse osmosis system in anyway, or, I'll pursue testing. And the PFAS too, I mean, we may look at areas, this isn't just applying to our area. This could be up in the North Country or some other area. So the PFAS may be there not through, the actions of Saint-Gobain.
But it's, it is a disclosure issue that people aren't going to know.
It would have to be disclosed, right. Let me see, Representative Healy, I think you had your hand up first. Did you have a comment or question?
Just as is a way you could just buy a house. It's very rare, but as is usually buy a house. Like we had some come up in the committee and R&D for septic systems out on the coastline. And people actually do go in and say, nope, don't want it tested. I just want the house just the way it is. Now, sometimes they go in and bulldoze the house and do something else. That's going along what you're saying. So yeah, they can always opt out.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Woods?
Yeah, a lot of these details we're discussing will all come to the fore in committee. There's going to be a lot of debate and all these details by amendment or whatever else, depending upon the LSR. I guess I wouldn't get into too much detail about what we recommend, but other than to recommend that this be a consideration during the sale, that there be some form of informed a mechanism to inform the buyer that it's there, but not a requirement of some kind. And the details of waiving and all those other kinds of things would be worked out in committee.
Yep, I agree. Thank you. Ms. Murphy, did you have your hand up?
I did. I was just going to say that it's true that in 2019, it was Representative Stack's bill to make the PFAS testing a condition of sale, so that buyers were informed, and there was significant pushback. And it didn't pass. The Realtors Association and everything came out suggesting that it would make it harder to sell homes. So, but that's as Ms. Allen pointed out, there's, people don't know, and that this information is vital to public health. So certainly, a legislative recommendation makes sense.
Okay, so I'm going to keep it as is. Now, what I'm going to do for those legislative recommendations is that the legislators who are on this commission, you may speak among yourselves if one of you wants to sponsor one of these recommendations. Okay, this is not, our recommendations are commission action, but moving ahead is going to be left up to the legislators. So that action of actually filing the bill is going to be that's going to be a choice that legislators can make. All right, so there may be legislators that says I'm not gonna file any of these. I'm not gonna sponsor any of these. There may be some that decide, yeah, let's go for it. So that's going to be a separate discussion among the legislators in the commission. Okay, so moving forward on the non-legislative recommendations, I did not go through these with a fine-tooth comb, but I do want to impress that I would like the commission to consider these goals for the next year. I'd hate to see recommendations like this. We report this to the state and then we don't take any action. If they're important to include in our report, they should be important that they can be part of our work plan moving forward. The first one is to evaluate the EPA interim health advisory. I anticipate the EPA. It's essentially making sure we stay informed and updated on actions the EPA is making. Any new regulations, new PFAS that they regulate. So it's essentially kind of doing what we've been doing, is just really trying to stay up on progress in this area at the national level. Pursue stricter adherence to rainwater and stormwater testing requirements. I can see that may be something that we had the conversation today's meeting about who makes the decision about stormwater testing. I'm not really sure it needs legislative action, but I think that I'd like to see some stricter parameters around the decision-making regarding stormwater testing. The next one was evaluate anticipated EPA CERCLA hazardous substance designation. As you know, the EPA has proposed adding PFOA and PFOS to CERCLA, which is the Superfund statute. So it's pretty much just evaluating that action moving forward, whether the proposal's been accepted or not. Explore adoption of PFAS surface water standards that may be coming from the EPA. It may be something that will require maybe legislation the next year. It's kind of a tough one. Consider adoption of PFAS soil standards to include alteration of terrain and agricultural use. So a lot of these things may become legislative recommendations next year, but they're not really ready for prime time. They're going to need more study and more definitive information. Assess the efficacy of remediation efforts at St. Gobain's Merrimack facility to airborne contamination. I don't know. I'm just kind of reading. I hope you've read these. There was, if we go down to number 8, it says explore citizens advisory panel to provide input at New Hampshire DES. Now, in my conversation with Mr. Wimsatt, he said we have 4 statutory councils already set up by division. So there are councils they may be made up of citizens, scientists, members of conservation commissions, and they meet monthly regarding topics that are specific to that division. So for instance, the Waste Management Division has a council that meets monthly. So I really don't think we need that. I think probably what we should do is have better communication and collaboration with these councils. I didn't even really know they existed. Also, the other thing with these councils, they hear all the appeals. So when there is an appeal, I think when St. Gobain appealed an air issue, that council heard the appeal. I saw somebody's hand go up and then was it you, Mr. Ayotte? No, okay. I saw somebody's
Mr. Druin saying goodbye, I think.
Oh, okay, all right.
Yeah, that's all it was.
Goodbye, Mr. Druin, thank you. So I think, I don't think we need a number 11, or else we can adapt it to learn more about these DES statutory councils and how to interact. But I don't know, if somebody wants to include that, that's fine. But I'm gonna probably just ixnay it. And then the last one is inform existing training of town health officers on PFAS health guidance. That was actually a legislative recommendation, but during my talk with Dr. Bush and Ms. Rogers, there's ongoing, there's a person at DHHS who's responsible for training and all the materials around health officers. So I thought if we could get it kind of and get engaged in that a little bit. I believe there is going to be they do have information on PFAS, but maybe if we could just follow up on that and make sure that that training is inclusive of PFAS. Ms. Rogers, do you want to comment on that at all? I think that was my
Thank you.
understanding. Yeah.
Sure, thank you, Representative Rung. Yes, I provided some information during my conversation and Dr. Bush's conversation with Representative Rung around health officers. Currently, per HB 79, which became in effect in, I think it was 2020, there is additional training for health officers provided per legislation. Right now, we have moved on to an online platform. So each health officer that's hired is trained with a kind of a basic information of their duties, the RSA, which governs their duties. Part of when I inquired with the program, I did learn that, you know, they do have general information about drinking water safety. There is a little bit of information about PFAS. And when I suggested, when I had told the program that there was this legislative recommendation, I asked whether, you know, would there be an opportunity to provide some additional information in that online training portal around additional PFAS information, and she said yes, there would be. So that is one thing that, you know, we certainly could explore if the committee was interested in, a commission was interested in following up, you know, for a non-legislative you know, solution to add more information for health officers and training. I just wanted to share that.
Okay, so I'm going to keep that last thing in for us to follow up at a future meeting. So when I look at these 11 recommendations, I would expect that we would tackle these in the coming year. So for instance, oh, and by the way, I took all the communication recommendations, things that were specific to and just put that into prepare a communication plan that considers the following. And so that would be a charge of the communication subcommittee. So my goal is that each one of these items would be something that we would want to achieve and accomplish in 2023. Okay. And then the last section of the report, there were many recommendations that really fall outside of our charge. So I lumped them in here because a lot of them do have they're more of a in the federal area. So for instance, labeling of PFAS. I had a bill to actually have a study committee to look into that. It died a COVID death when it missed the deadlines back in 2020. But that there is work in the on the federal level, and I think that's an appropriate place for it because it's going to really involve, it's going to impact interstate commerce. I would hate to have a labeling requirement in New Hampshire and find out that all these companies aren't going to sell in New Hampshire because of it, and it disrupts our commerce. So it is definitely an appropriate action for the federal government, and I know they're working on it. They're also working on the next bullet, which is to define essential use. So it would essentially ban PFAS from non-essential use, like PFAS wouldn't be allowed in dental floss anymore and all this other stuff. So that work is being done at the federal level. I don't know how successful it will be, but it may be worthwhile in a future meeting to have a presentation by representatives of our federal delegation to give us an update on that. I know a couple of years ago we did have an update, I believe, by Representative Pappas and Senator Shaheen's office to tell us what was going on. So we're probably due to have one of that update to see how things are moving on these recommendations. The other bullet was to creation of a regional committee, including municipal, town, and citizen representatives to create and coordinate a 5-year plan to best utilize federal and state funds earmarked for PFAS impacted communities. I think that's a great idea, but it's gonna involve a lot more communities. So I think that's more something that the state would want to work in, or it's not something we should drive outside of, let's say, people in the seacoast or communities who've had PFAS contamination from firehouses. So I still included it, but I wanted to make sure it's not like something that can be, think of these things in this last session, or things, okay, would these be on our agenda to do? That's not something that would be on our agenda to do. We would have to pull in a lot of other people. And same thing with the next one, monitoring review of statewide PFAS contamination of private and or public drinking water. We do it, you know, we do that every month. We get updates on that for the 4 communities in our commission. But I don't think it's appropriate for us to do that for other communities as well. That would probably fall under more of a statewide group that looks at all communities. And then an inventory and map of other statewide sites at risk, a review of wastewater treatment facility, PFAS contamination data and research. I mean, that's actually was something that Mr. Druin was discussing. So it's already, that's being done by DES. It's not something that we can drive. I'm moving along quickly here because I'm sensitive to time. Next one, a request of UNH Cooperative Extension and Department of Agriculture to develop and provide information to the public on PFAS testing recommendations and best practices to avoid PFAS contamination of commercial and home food production. And that gets exactly to the work that Dr. Patali's doing. And then funding source for remediation, municipal landfills and firefighting. Our charge is really specific to the contamination from Saint-Gobain. So this would have to be done outside of our commission's work. And then PFAS testing of newly drilled wells and reporting of exceedances to NHDES. Again, that would fall out of the purview of our commission. But I think all of these things are worth mentioning. So that's why I still recommend keeping them included in our report. Any comments? I certainly hope Representative LaSalle is still on the phone because I think we're approaching our quorum.
Rosemary,
Yes.
Representative Rung, I am here.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.
The sound you hear is my hand waving.
Oh, okay. Okay, so
I may have missed it, and if I did, please correct me. But did you update the numbers in the executive summary? I noticed that there are numbers missing in the executive summary.
yes, Representative LaSalle, you looked at draft 3, which I think I sent out last night, late afternoon. I got those numbers from Mr. Wimsat yesterday, or maybe late. It might have been late Wednesday, but no, all the numbers are updated.
I have draft 3, and there are numbers missing.
Oh, where do you see that?
In the executive summary, the first paragraph after the italics.
Okay. Does anybody else see that too? I wonder, because I have the numbers.
Is at the time of this report, comma, approximately blank household in Merrimack, Bedford.
You don't see, it says 2,300?
No.
Okay.
Might have like the track changes view differently. If you do like
okay.
Original.
Okay, well, I do have all those numbers included. They are updated. I'll make sure that the final one we have, you have all those numbers included. He had sent me his version from track changes, and I thought I accepted all of those so that it appeared in the final report, but I'll make sure it's clear. I also have a new computer and a new version of Word, and I don't know if it's conflicting with the old version.
I was gonna say I can see the numbers, but it's still marked as a track change. It's not.
Oh, okay. All right. I'll go in. I'll make sure that's fixed.
I can see the numbers also. Marked as a change though.
Okay. I'll make sure to make sure the final version. And actually, what I'll do when we vote on this, it actually goes to committee services, and they do formatting. They put it on House letterhead, and I mean, Ann Fitzgerald does all that cleanup. So, yes, Representative Healy.
Just one more thing. I noticed on the one that you had the non-legislative one, number 4, number 5, you had the bill that we had before. So if you want to add HB 1167 and HB 1440, those were both surface water standards. I think one of them was yours too. So you just might want to have those for reference going forward.
Oh, the legislative progress?
The non-legislative recommendations are made on page 9 on bullet number 4.
Oh, okay, let me see.
It had 1457 on number 5. You might want to put 1167 and 1440 on number 4. Like I said, one of them I think was yours. One of them might have been Representative Woods, I believe.
Okay, so are you talking about page 9, Representative?
Yeah, page 9, bullet number 4. You want to put, you already had some surface water standards, just for page holders so that people don't reinvent the wheel. HB 1160.
See, now that actually would be a, that would be, let me go back. Because I don't believe the surface water, the bill for surface water, that was interim study.
Yes.
So, okay. So it would be a recommendation to refile that legislation.
Yeah, either 1167 or 1440, yeah. Just so they're not reinventing the wheel, just as they have a placeholder when they go to file it.
Okay, all right, I got it. All right, so yes, Ms. Murphy.
Thank you. Actually, I'm going to have to get off. I just wanted to mention one thing. As the PFAS-related public health impacts worker of the HB 85 Commission, environmentally triggered chronic illness, shared the HB 737's identified need for health provider education in the past. It might be good to note that some of this training for the Northern New England nurse practitioners has begun, spearheaded by HB 85 Commission member Peg DiTullio and supported and in concert with DEH and DHHS. I know it's being done by HB 85, but I think one of the big questions was around health impacts, and the recommendation was for health provider education. So I think it's worthy of note that this commission isn't doing it, but it is in process at least by another commission.
Okay, so what I'd like to do is, Ms. Murphy, if you could send me language of where to put that in.
Okay. Yep.
And Representative Healy, if you could, on as far as 1167 and 1140, if you could send me language and placement for those placeholders, I will add that to draft 4. And I will distribute that. I'm not going to take a vote now because we've lost our quorum. I'm gonna, have a draft 4 with those inclusions, and then I'm gonna ask Ms. Russo if we could have like a 5 or 10 minute meeting in a couple weeks to take a vote. How does everybody think about that? Okay, I'll do that. So it won't be very long, but we'll make that November 1st deadline. It'll probably be, if I can ask Representative Healy and Ms. Murphy to get me your changes by Tuesday, end of the day, that gives me time, and I'll actually post a meeting for a week from today. All right, from 10 to like 10:10. Does that work for everybody? All I need is a quorum. It'll just be 10 minutes to take the vote. All right, so that would be, let me see, we are October, today's the 14th, so it'll be the 21st. We'll have a meeting, and then that gives them like 10 days to get the report to the governor. So we'll be all set. So we'll have that, and I'll confirm with Ms. Russo if we can do that from like 10 a.m. to 10:10, 10 minutes total. Okay, and I'll have those changes from you, and I guess that's it. So is there any other business that the commission members want to bring forward? All right, so we can't take a vote to adjourn, so because we don't have a quorum, so we're just gonna say goodbye and have a great weekend. Thank you, everybody. Thanks for your patience today. All right.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Yep, bye-bye.